Hello, everyone. Today, we are going to be discussing the significance of using umbrella species as a tool for conservation biology. Going into the presentation, we'll be looking at the definition of umbrella species and other key terms to help us gain a wider and broader understanding of their interconnectedness to conservation biology. We will also be defining the criteria that scientists have used for selecting umbrella species. And following that, we'll be looking at a research article and how scientists have looked at goshawks as the umbrella species and specifically identifying the habitats that are most abundant for biodiversity in order for us to understand which habitats need to be preserved and protected across the world. And then following that, we're going to go into why do we care and some key takeaway points. Umbrella species are defined as certain species that are selected for making conservation-related decisions. They gain their name from the term umbrella because protecting these individual species indirectly protects the many other species that make up the ecological community within their habitat. So if you guys can imagine an umbrella, and at the top of the umbrella are organisms such as a Latin American jaguar, where if we can protect the areas and ranges of which they live in, we will also indirectly protect their prey, their prey's prey, and then within that, all the habitat that coexist together. And then based on that, umbrella species we use for conservation biologists help select target areas for protection. And basically it gives us a shortcut to help us inform of what areas need to be protected and also lead to future decisions of potential areas within not just Latin America, but other regions as well. And here you have a couple more examples of a right whale and a Siberian tiger, and a majority of the means for selecting umbrella species is because of their very, very large home range. So once we have protected these areas, a majority of the time we indirectly protect the other species as well. Another key term is indicator species, and this is defined as a species or group of species whose presence or population helps mirror the biotic and abiotic state of the environment that they inhabit. They also are known as bioindicators, and they provide evidence for environmental change and biodiversity. And two of the really most common ones, and the ones I found that are pretty relatable to us, are honeybees and the coral reef. Bees mainly because if you haven't seen the movie Bees, they kind of give us a very dramatic but comprehensible outcome of what would happen to the world if there were no bees to pollinate. We would lose a lot of flower. We would lose many, many other organisms because the pollination effects that are relied on because of bees. And then coral reefs, another great indicator because they house hundreds and hundreds of species within their habitats. And they also protect coastlines from storms and various other external effects. And here, frogs are also used as indicator species because of their semi-permeable skin. So they are very, very reactive to external pollutants in both air and water because their life cycle stages span both terrestrial and aquatic stages. And then on the bottom right is algal bloom in Lake Erie. And it's important to understand microorganisms as indicator species because if you understand what algal bloom does, which is they cover the surface of the lake by absorbing photosynthesis and nutrients that come from the lake, they block out a lot of light that should reach the other plant organisms underneath, and they outcompete a lot of other organisms by blocking out the light. So a lot of fish that rely on sight for hunting, and then a lot of other plants that rely on photosynthesis to thrive, the algal blooms act as an indicator, usually in a negative sense, for the wellness of the environment. And the final term that ties everything together is the bigger picture of surrogate species. And surrogate species are defined as representatives of multiple species or aspects of an environment. And these species are usually categorized above umbrella species and indicator species, and the subsets of umbrella species and indicator species make up surrogates. So they usually allow for the planning of how we can indicate what species need to be protected in order to understand how they affect the landscape and how they affect the response within the ecosystem. Going into the main themes for selecting the umbrella species, co-occurrence is arguably one of the most critical factors for selecting umbrella species because it helps us understand the potential relationships between organisms. And the metaphor I like to draw on for this is, as humans, we engage in a lot of relationships, whether they are platonic, or they are romantic. And I want to think of in a school situation where you like to preserve and keep the relationships between your professors and peers in class because they benefit you, because you don't want to negatively impact any group work situation. You don't want to possibly offend a professor that could write you a recommendation, and you want to preserve their relationships. However, in a sense where you're in a toxic relationship or in a situation where it doesn't benefit you, you are more likely to cut the ties. And if we can understand how co-occurrence happens between species, and how if I introduce a white wolf within a gray wolf into an ecosystem, how does that impact the elk? How does that impact coyotes, and vice versa? So it's a top-down effect of understanding the relationship between species. The second theme that scientists generally go towards for selecting umbrella species is the degree of ubiquity. And ideally, we don't want them to be on either one of the spectrum. We don't want them to be super rare, and we don't want them to be extremely ubiquitous. The main reason for that is ubiquitous species are unlikely to serve as an effective umbrella because they occur in so many locations with relatively low species riches. And one prime example that you guys can possibly relate this to is elk. Right? They kind of occur across a large portion of the Midwest as well as northern states, and they migrate a lot well. So yes, we can kind of look at their populations for that, but since they're so common, it's significantly harder to peg their impact of them in their environment. And on the other hand, we don't want them to be super duper rare as well, such as the snow leopard, because then we can't apply the concept of umbrella species to other environments, because we would only be allocating resources to conserving that specific location where that animal is inhabiting. So we kind of have to find the balance within those two. And the third and final one is the sensitivity to human disturbance. And we want to consider that species all respond differently to various disturbances. Because human land use poses the greatest threat to most species, we concentrate on sensitivity to human disturbances as opposed to sensitivity to natural phenomena such as weather and other extreme cases such as disease. And we presume that sensitive species will provide a protective umbrella for others that are equally or less sensitive in the human activities. And to understand that, we kind of have to see where they live, where their food source lives, and how their food sources interact with the rest of the habitat. And going into the goshawk paper, the paper that was prevalent before this was actually establishing goshawks as an umbrella species, not in Japan, but in the Italian Alps. And they were able to determine that because offering protection of the goshawk regions also offer protection to other bird species, as well as butterflies and other background species. And in this paper titled A Mechanistic Approach to the Evaluation of Umbrella Species as Conservation Surrogates, the scientists wanted to specifically observe the biodiversity of other birds, butterflies, caribids, aka beetles, and then forest floor plants, and a number of forest sites to evaluate whether the sites selected by umbrella species approach are efficient protecting the species diversities of the other four taxa. In other words, they wanted to see if selecting specific sites based on the definition of umbrella species of goshawks would also provide us information of the abundance of biodiversity of the other 4 animals and organisms as well. Going to the methods, this observational experiment took place in Hokkaido, which is a northern island in Japan, specifically in the Ishikari region, which is located here on the western coast, right above the city of Sapporo. And a lot of it took place within a 1,600-kilometer space within this area region as well. And that also incorporated any agricultural lands, as you can see in the lighter shades, that surround the forest, and then spots within the forest. And they took this approach by first observing the home ranges of the goshawks for about 4 years via radio tracking telemetry. And then they also conducted species diversity surveys at 44 different other sites that were very similarly comparable in size to the home ranges of the goshawks. And they took the surveys of birds, butterflies, beetles, and plant life. The way they took this was they set up a 1-kilometer track within each of the sites. So that's 1 kilometer for 44 across. So there was a lot of data collection here. And they did it for an hour. And specifically, they did it for the birds, and they only looked at birds that were above the canopy already. They didn't observe any birds flying through or across. They only observed birds going straight ahead to eliminate any source of double counting. And then for counting the plants, they set up transects of 50 by 10, and they made sure that only vascular plants that were larger than 2 meters were recorded. Going into the data, they created several surrogate schemes. And basically the premise for the surrogate schemes was to understand the major component of that site that attributed to the abundance of the biodiversity of the other creatures. And they are listed on the top here. So the home ranges was the control group that they originally took out, and that was based on the observation of the 4-year data collected on the radio telemetry of the goshawks. So they calculated that. With the predicted occupancy, they created a habitat model of this equation below, and X1 refers to proportion of open land near forest, X2 refers to the portion of forest interior, X3 proportion of water, and X4 is the slope. Excuse me. They were able to calculate predicted occupancy based on this formula. The slope was any area measured in degrees, and they found the mean and the mode of that. And they calculated across all these schemes the slope of the land in degrees. So that gives us a reference to understand the elevation of each area. And then they took the highest variable for each site. So not every site was open forest, but what they did was they found that as the main factor and focused solely on that. And then they did it subsequently for these following data sets. Now, what these numbers tell us is the higher the number, you can think of the less potent it was for that variable. So less taxon were observed as a biodiversity for the higher numbers, and the lower the numbers, the more biodiverse the population of the taxon were. So to visualize this, that they gave us a bar graph of the species percentage on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, they gave us the surrogate schematic. All right, so the abbreviations here is the home range. For this one was the predicted occupancy. This one was the slope, so the elevation. This was the open forest land. This was the interior forest land. And this one was the slope. And off the bat, if we look at the control compared to the rest, there is a significant increase of biodiversity across the board. So there is no argument here to the understanding that some of the selected sites had higher biodiversities compared to their home range. What this tells us is, as far as goshawks being an umbrella species goes, they cover a wide range scope for the landscapes that are selected to be possibly protected. Um, Going forward, you can see the predicted occupancy doesn't give us much data, but if we look at only the birds, so that would be the black bars here, going across, besides any location over water, there is similar, if not higher amounts of bird populations within the slope, the interior of the forest, and, or sorry, the open lands near the forest, and then the interior of the forest. So what this helps us understand that is, in any locations that we expect to see goshawks, we also expect to see higher numbers of biodiversities of bird species. And this can also be attributed to the same as beetles and butterflies in some of these cases. Not so much in the open lands near the forest or the interior of the forest, but more so there. So we see variance across the board for where species are abundantly located. One of the reasons why they believe for this high variance is the hunting pattern for goshawks. They normally prefer to hunt in the interior of the forest where there's a lot of protection from them for themselves and to hide from their prey. But they also indicated a interesting behavior for the goshawks where they preferred sometimes to relocate themselves to the edge of the forest where it gave them less protection, but it also gave their prey less protection where they could dart out of the forest and then back into the forest after catching their prey. So it's significant to understand that even though we can define the goshawks as umbrella species, they are not the most prominent as indicator species because their home range is so large and they shift around depending on their hunting patterns as they go. And it's really important for us to understand the use of umbrella species because it allows us to create shortcuts and look at which location specifically we should be allocating our sources. Because a lot of times we have an idea or a goal in conservation biology, and it's really hard to translate it into a manageable project that has the proper funding, has the proper support behind it. Because in a perfect world, we all want to say, we need to protect this animal and let's shove all our money towards it. That can't really happen because realistically speaking, we need policy and other governmental support to make sure to ensure that a lot of these species are protected now and then for future generations. In retrospect, it's also important to understand that umbrella species help conserve smaller species. There is some risk factor of where we overlook certain species because of a wide home range habitat where, jaguars and Siberian tigers, and in this case goshawks, they can cover significant amounts of land, and it's really, really hard to properly allocate which region of land needs to be protected. But getting a better understanding of applying the umbrella species approach would really help us take away and understand which specific region we needed to protect. And thank you for listening to my presentation. Hope you guys have a wonderful time. And that is it. Bye.